The next technology or set of technologies for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and this is a renewable energy technology, is solar hot water, and it has huge potential in Australia. Only 5% of households in this country have solar hot water. And yet, with the current government rebate, $1,000 from the federal government and a few $100s from most state governments, it's cost effective in most parts of Australia over its lifetime. And yet it's not being implemented widely. And again, the reason is really market failure. And yet there is actually quite large potential for solar hot water to cut emissions. And according to my calculations, we could retire 4,600 megawatts of coal-fired power in this country, which are being run between midnight and dawn, heating water in electric resistance hot water systems around the country. And that's all they do between midnight and dawn. Those stations could be shut down. The water heating could be done by solar or gas if people don't have sunshine on their roofs, or in the few cases where they don't have sunshine or gas, electric heat pump systems, which are far more efficient than the existing electric hot water systems. Okay, now we come to energy supply. And as I said, as I sort of intimated perhaps, wind power is actually the cheapest of the new renewable energy sources of electricity. And it's certainly, with the right kind of government policies, we could certainly generate 10% of our electricity already by 2020 from the wind and 20% by 2030. Beyond 20%, it becomes rather more expensive to integrate wind power into the grid system. But 20% isn't terribly radical. Denmark achieved 20% back in 2003. Large-scale wind power can substitute for some baseload coal, and I will describe how this works in a moment. But first, I mean, one has to say there is a lot of misinformation being circulated about wind power from vested interests. And in fact, the key source of misinformation for anti-wind groups in Australia and around the world is a group in Britain called Country Guardian. Vice President of Country Guardian is Sir Bernard Ingham, who until recently was the head of the main nuclear power promoting body in the UK. In Australia, both the uranium industry and the coal industry disseminate a lot of this misleading information about wind power. Of course, wind turbines have to be on ridges and hills so they are visible and they will have a visible impact, but whether that is positive or negative depends on personal taste. But I would argue that it is improper for people who do not want to see wind turbines to argue all the other exaggerated claims against wind power, which are mostly either untrue or grossly exaggerated. As a former CSIRO scientist, I led the research group that did a lot of the early work in Australia on this in the 1980s, on integrating wind power into electricity grid. And we did mathematical modelling and computer modelling and so on. And we found that, in fact, this is a furphy, that if you have, certainly if you look at a single wind turbine in low wind conditions, it is intermittent in the sense that it switches on and off all the time, and obviously very unreliable. But if you look at the electrical output of a system of wind turbines scattered over a large geographic region, which is what we're really talking about here, experiencing different wind conditions, although the output does vary, it varies fairly smoothly, generally in an undulating fashion. And although it isn't quite as reliable as a coal-fired power station, it can easily be made as reliable by adding a few gas turbines. This is a picture of a study I did for Greenpeace last year on whether we could in fact get a 30% reduction in Australia's emissions compared with business as usual, that's the BAU up there at the top, by 2020. And it's not easy. This is a technological scenario here, and the biggest reductions come from energy efficiency, followed by renewable energy, and then completing the termination of land clearing and deforestation comes next, then cutting the so-called fugitive emissions that come from gas fields and gas pipes and coal mines and things like that, making aluminium smelting greenhouse neutral, and Dr. Sadler noted that aluminium smelting alone is a huge chunk of Australia's electricity generation. The figures I had for 2004 was 13%, but Hugh Sadler says in his notes that it actually increases to 18% more recently from one industry, and that is subsidised electricity that they receive. And then in agriculture, agriculture is Australia's second biggest source after stationary sources of energy to produce greenhouse gases. And it's mainly cows and sheep belching methane gas. So we need to reduce our consumption of beef and cattle, either becoming vegetarian or closer to being vegetarians, or perhaps eating a bit of kangaroo occasionally. An outrageous suggestion from an environmentalist, I know. Now, in my scenario in 2007, I calculated that the energy efficiency potential was about 80 megatons of carbon dioxide by 2020. In 2008, the very prestigious McKinsey Corporation calculated the actual costs of reducing emissions, and they came out with the same figure, astonishingly, 80 million tonnes of carbon dioxide. On the left there, those bars going down are cost savings. They have negative costs. And then, I mean, this supports my argument that, in fact, energy efficiency can offset a large part of the additional costs of renewable energy. On the right-hand side, you've got the technologies, mostly on the supply side, that do have additional costs. And so you can see that if you look at the areas under those curves, that'll give you an idea of the total cost savings. So there's a big chunk of cost savings that come from energy efficiency. What's even better is that there are more jobs from a renewable energy future, which is also energy efficient. And the reason that we get more jobs from renewable energy within Australia is not that renewable energy is less economically efficient in some sense. It's simply that the smaller scale technology lends itself to local manufacture. Of course, we're not sitting on our hands before 2020. We're also developing the big technologies that can contribute after 2020. And the two biggest are solar power, potentially, currently very expensive, but going to be much cheaper after 2020, and hot rock geothermal power. Now, there's two forms of solar power. This is the form, photovoltaics, that you've all seen on a few rooftops scattered around, and the top picture shows them being used as roof tiles in a particular area. Solar power has one limitation that various anti-renewable energy politicians and others have loved to point out, that the sun actually doesn't shine at night. And it is quite expensive to store electricity overnight in huge batteries or other storages. And photovoltaics produces electricity directly. So that's a limitation. It is daytime power. But of course, that's not such a bad thing, because most of the power that we actually use is used during the daytime.